Okay. All right. So as I said, transition, and I particularly this is I've presented this internationally as well as, in different conferences last year. But there was a point where, other than what occurred last year at Tamaki College, where we really had this optimal wraparound transition into school and then ongoing programming. So I thought you might be interested if you haven't attended anything that you've listened to me about this, and then the initial assessment, and particularly thinking about foundation students. So I'm going to do a quick just alert to some of the theories, just why, particularly because I think, we on the ground in our practice, we often, someone says, well, why do this and why do that? I think it's good for us to be able to rationalize it under strong theories of learning and frameworks of learning. So I'm just going to quickly touch on that. And then particularly I want this for the first part to to put your attention on to what I think are the core intentions, and you might be just saying yes, 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 and that would be good. And then hopefully we've got time to move on to initial assessment and programming. All right. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but if in what I developed around presenting this, I presented it as a sociological lens on education. And that sounds really flash for the work that we're doing, doesn't it? But I believe that that's exactly what we're doing. And then if you think so, how do you then, present that theoretically? Well, you can look at the ecology of education and the very well-known Bronfenbrenner with the different systems, these systems. And then if we were to spend a little middle time, you can look here that in fact, we're not only focusing on the micro, but we're also focusing on all of these kinds of system areas within the ecosystem. But ultimately, that's, at the top there, that's what we want. We want to be change makers or difference makers for the students that we've got in front of us. In a nutshell, inclusive education, participation, achievement, value of the person. That's what we're trying to do, of course. And I very strongly am orientated as you are towards Vygotsky and that language is the material, it's the tool of human interaction, and then the guru of all systemic functional linguistics, Vygotsky, Halliday, and so. I know this just seems like touch base, but if you would want these slides, I'm happy to share them with you so that you can sort of think to yourself, yes, we're practical, and yes, we're always trying to do the best and tweak and be responsive, but this is why we're doing it from the big educational philosophy point of view, sociological point of view. Right. And you can please ask questions at the end. Rachana, I hope you're making a note of when I need to stop. And if you want to put something on the chat, but you're all looking at one device, so maybe there's not an idea for chat, but if you've got a piece of paper and you want to jot something down to ask me, or stop me in the middle, which will have to be, Jannie, stop, move on. All right, I'm okay with that, honestly. All right, so just to give an example, and you're probably, this is by no means, but we know about diversity, don't we? So over the last few years, at Tamaki College as an example, and my context is quite different now at Sacred Heart, where they are international students largely from China and from Korea and Japan, but then we have a smattering of other countries as well that we know that, we particularly, I don't know in the West where you're getting your refugees from, but then we're getting migrants from a whole variety of countries right across the world. This is what our reality was between 2020 and 24 and so there was this exponential rise of refugee students, and we had to be very agile in responding to that because up to then we hadn't really received refugee students, and the programs that were in there for new migrants were well, not tailored for refugee students in particular, and the optimal wasn't in operation, I don't think. So what I want you to think about is those three areas. At your school, what are you doing? In the ideal, what would you like your school to do? And what are the benefits and gains and challenges and issues? So, we can aspire to certain things, but often the optimal doesn't happen for a whole variety of reasons. And I won't go into it because I'm experiencing that myself. So all we can do is chip away to somehow or another optimize what, and Rome wasn't built in a day, so we have to sometimes go slowly to get there. So I just want to emphasize this. And again, I don't want to tell you what you already know and you're doing, but I think you would probably agree with me that knowing the learner is at the heart of everything. And when I say knowing the learner, it means knowing the learner and their family, because the student brings their family to school, even though it might be a silent family and we can't see them, but inevitably their home life and their family and their context beyond school are what they bring into the classroom all the time. So there are so many layers of how do we get to know their story, and some are very ongoing and informal as you gather more and more information, and some of them can be really intensive interviews, and somehow also making connections with their families. But if we don't do this, and I'm in a context now where, in actual fact, we don't do this, but there's a particular reason why with the international students, I feel uncomfortable with it because I don't think that I can really know my students well enough to teach them in the classroom, because they are more than students, and yet in many ways I know so little about them. So just want to emphasize that learning their stories is critical, and it's especially critical for our refugee students, but it's critical for new migrants in general, because everyone's got challenges and trauma, even if it seemingly is a smooth, immigration process. I will skip this, but if you want me to show it later, these are really beautiful interviews with two of my refugee students. They're really powerful and they're lovely to listen to. But for want of time, I'm going to skip through that, and let's focus on the core attentions. Now, again, I want you to think about yourself in your context, and you might say, yeah, we do that well. Yes, that's what we do. And we ask ourselves, do we do this for refugees? Do we do it for all migrants? So bilingual support, I'm presuming that you have either some or quite a number of these wonderful people called bilingual learning assistants. And in my work, they're just critical players in the context I'm working now, but also when I was working at Tamaki College, they were vital, and are especially vital for foundation students, new learners of English, new migrants who have just come to the country and may or may not have really strong English. But to me, language is culture and culture is language. So to have bilingual learning assistants available, and to have them in your classroom, as well as for other tasks that they might do in terms of mediation and translation and connection with families, they're really important. So I'm going to just explore this a little bit more later, but the process is in transition. You can have it okay, or you can have it as optimal as you possibly can get it. And I'd like to think that you're all already have, or you're moving towards an optimal transition into school process and orientation. But it's always, it's a moving feast, isn't it? And whatever decisions you're making about the English language program, again, that's complex, as you know, and I know. And you might have an optimal in your head, the ideal, but the ideal sometimes doesn't um, match up with the reality, unfortunately. So I've mentioned learning their stories and the subject selection, and how do you go about doing that? And then you ask yourself, if it's for refugees, what about, is it the same for migrant students, same or different? I'd love to hear what you think about that, but for me, it's the same in large part. Um, I'm teaching EAL to international students, but these are also really and really important. And if you're not careful, they get truncated by different people rather than as a team. Now, I'm being just, candid to you because I'm basing it on my own experience every day. And so, you might not agree or not. I'm not here really to have, you know, uh, I'm presenting how I see things, and we can talk about that when there's Q&A. So, health needs, again, you may say, well, yes, that's absolutely definitely important for refugee students. And at Tamaki College, we did a real wraparound for this. But even in the context where I am now, although it's being left to families to see to that, even for where we might be saying a student is not coping at school for personality reasons, for transition into New Zealand reasons, we are in our context leaving it largely up to the family. You pay and you get the support you think you need. In my view, I think it should be different. Like even as simple as some of the students, sort of squinting the eyes because they can't see, and when I suggest that we just do a simple eye check, that doesn't necessarily just flow into action. So I think this is really important. As they can become very isolated and they can become very in group. And, how we do that so that they actually can comfortably, and that the Kiwi, excuse me, English speaking, or those that are comfortable in our society now, in our community, reach into our students rather than what I've always said right from the beginning in my work is that we have to reach into them rather than they have to reach towards us. But we know at this age with, hormones running and teen changes, that friendship and peer support is critical. For refugees, that was a big one for us. It's not a big one for my current context, but there are loads and loads, I'm sure you're finding that, of financial struggles in families. And that's especially true when they're being moved on from from housing to emergency accommodation and then back to something else that they think might be stable and isn't, and it all costs money. We have found that digital support for the refugees is critical. Often they haven't used and are not familiar with any kind of digital learning. And actually, the same has occurred with our international students. You cannot assume that they know how to use the digital programs and devices at school. And so special attention to that is needed. And yeah, this is really critical. They're young people and they want to be involved, and it's a really circuit breaker for stress. So again, the question, same or different for refugees and for new migrants? I suggest that it's the same, except maybe the financial support may be, not so much an issue, and maybe the digital support not, but the others are. Maybe less for health needs for new migrants because they would have had to have a health check when they arrive, but so do our international students. And then for refugees, well, this is really critical. And at Tamaki College, we had 1.5 years of weekly art therapy. And that was such a game changer for our students. It took a long time for them to loosen up and to be able to, through art in various ways, not just painting and drawing, they were able, I suppose, to express their feelings more. And it also was quite an intercultural experience that within the group there was tension, and we managed to dissipate a lot of that tension and build different friendships. And of course, we do that all the time, don't we? But the more we know about the countries and the languages and the families, the more that we're able to value and really be excited by the honor of having them as our students and their families here in our community. So that means family support. And again, with the bilingual assessments that I do, it always comes to pass how we might assume that the families are coping at home, but the struggles are immense. And if we don't know and we don't bother to find out, then, this student that's right in front of you maybe grappling with quite considerable from, mental health of a family, or actually physical health, or, the trauma of losing a family member in Afghanistan, or in Palestine, or in the Gaza, whatever it is, that this is all really important. And I mentioned this, but transport, etc. So I don't know if this little core attentions kind of checklist is useful to you, and if I had time, I'd get you to discuss it and say, what's on top for you? Are you doing all of these well? And then you really need to drill down into each one. So bilingual support, I mean, I'm not going to go into that, but at Tamaki College, we had these learning assistants. This young man, Rahman, was a real asset because he was not much older than the students, and the students loved him. At the current school I'm at, we've got 7, 8 learning assistants, so they're invaluable both in our EAL classes, but also in supporting the students across the curriculum. Now, the transition process, again, yours will vary to across the schools that are in the room, but in my view, that you would have these kind of 3 layers. One is that, yes, you do your basic paperwork and you might use a bilingual form, but you arrange an appointment for an in-depth enrollment. At that enrollment, a member of the senior leadership team, ESOL lead teacher, a learning assistant, the student, and the family. And if need be, you usually don't need another mediating person brought by the family, but if they want to bring some support, and this will inform your initial placement and programming decisions, and that no matter what, whether they're ALP foundational, ALP 1 or ALP 2 or ALP 3, and we may not know that just yet, but on the basis of the information that we have, that there is a 1 to 2 day orientation around not only the school and the teachers and the whole atmosphere of the school community, but also that it gives you an opportunity to conduct more assessments. Now, would you like me to stop for a minute for a pause, or shall I go on? Tell me. I can't hear you.
Put food. No, just put the food out. Yeah. The packets. Does anyone have questions or want to discuss, or do you just want Jannie to continue?
I've got a quick question. Are you able to just tell us very quickly what that 2-day enrolment thing looked like? So you mean they wouldn't attend classes for their first 2 days?
Attend classes for 2 days, no.
Yeah, so the dean, who was showing them around? Who was sort of helping with that 2-day thing?
Sometimes it was the bilingual learning assistant. Sometimes it was, if one of us in the team could be free, took that role. Sometimes if there was someone of that language and country background, it could be a senior student that is already, settled in and articulate in the language of the student. If the family is there, it's better to have an adult from the school staff, but that it is a time to, I suppose, ease them, make them feel that we're an inclusive, friendly group here, and that they can get an, it's my international students ever say how scared they were when on those first days. And while they do have an orientation day, it's really short and sharp, and it's very dedicated to assessment, when really, in my view, there's a lot more just walking around, feeling easy, just, the trauma of just landing off the plane and coming here to a school that's alien to them. All of that, I think, even 1 to 2 days isn't enough, and that's why buddying for longer term support's really important.
Can I ask on that, because we've got like a 2-day international student orientation, but we don't have anything for migrant refugees. But we get that every week or 2 weeks, we get 1 or 2. So do you like group them together and they start at the same time, or do you do it each week, or how does that?
No, we don't. So, you can't always predict when they're going to come. if you could, maybe you could do a little group thing, but I think the personal approach is really important. So how it happened, it's different where I am now. And they did, although some are trickling in, they largely started as a cohort at various year levels, but they were all kind of in this orientation 2 days. But it was too, in my view, it was too orientated towards assessment and very, dense with information. Um, but at Tamaki College, we uh, we never could predict quite when someone would roll up. And so a senior leader took that role on in collaboration with us, the team, that she would just come up and say, look, we've got a new student. Here's the family. He'll come and meet. We'd like to come and meet you. And we'd stop what we're doing and introduce ourselves and all smile because we wanted to make a lovely warm welcome. So it was very responsive to the unpredictable nature of people rolling up. And I guess that if you're mostly getting students from the Mangani Refugee Centre, then you might say, well, there's a cohort coming because they're all on the six weeker at the centre. But we, with the refugees that were largely the non-quota refugees and also not strictly refugees, but certainly fleeing their countries for various reasons like Colombia or Chile, then we were just responsive. If they were there and they were at the school, we wouldn't take them the minute they rolled up to school, but we would say, start this day and come, and we would be responsive to that individual student. Anything else? Now, again, there's always, reasons why the framework becomes this or the framework becomes that. But I think my suggestion to you is keep the optimal in mind and chip away because if I'm not always the most patient person, but one of the things that I have learned over all my years in schools is that if you have an optimal and you chip away and you chip away, you can get there and achieve near to optimal if you're patient enough and give it a good enough reason why it should occur. And as I said to you, Rome is not built in a day, and sometimes you get pushback, but in a pleasant way, you keep being tenacious for being able to make that transition into school as supportive and warm and loving and inclusive as possible. I think we underestimate the challenge that students face and their families face. I don't know if any one of you in the room might have yourself been a recent immigrant to a new country or even been immigrants yourself here, but certainly we were, and the the recognition of us as a Dutch family was pretty minimal to none, really. And I suppose some of that I would like to have, I think has informed the way that I think about things and what we can do now. We're 2026, and surely we should be doing something really stunning, I think, now. All right, so shall I move on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So time is trotting along, but just you might be interested in this. This is kind of how we looked at things at Tamaki College anyway. It's not the way we necessarily are looking at in the current school I'm in. But if they were foundation, new learners of English, then they largely had an intense foundation program. I'll show you what a typical timetable might have looked like. And we had to make decisions with the student, with the family, based on the assessment information we gathered, whether they would just stay in foundation. So some of our students maybe were only taking one other subject that they possibly could at least participate in, and even if they didn't have much English, could feel that they could be involved. And some of them, maybe took two, but never much more. But then if you look here at the partial mainstream, at least being mid to late ALP students, then they got academic English, but they um, were maybe likely to have two subjects, three subjects at the most, but it depended on the student because we can also not assume that they all learn, they are all different, they're diverse in their learning, and we've certainly had one, two, three, four students that just find learning simply hard, and so then hence you need to think about when do you need a bilingual assessment. But you know perfectly well if you're teaching refugee students that some of them may have been in camps for years and years and years. Some of them might have been in transition between four different countries. And so all of that needs, that's why Know Your Learner is definitely behind what you finally might say is again a tentative placement where you are prepared to be agile and responsive according to what's going on. I think we also need to keep hearing the voice of the student, and largely they won't voice it necessarily unless you have a really empathetic learning assistant team or you yourself are of that culture and of that language. And then for different reasons, some students will take ALP, will take mainstream subjects, but they always will have academic English. And I'll show you what that looks like in terms of timetabling. But again, everything costs, and students are really keen to be like the others, but, and holding them to understand, holding them, to more English language support is sometimes a little bit like trying to hold a little spaniel because they are so keen to learn, but they really don't face the reality until they hit the fan of mainstream learning, how challenging it is and how long it takes to acquire English. And we know that from all the research. It's pretty unchallengeable that 5 to 7 years is needed to get to anywhere near academic English and be able to cope well at year 13 level and beyond. So for the year 9s and 10s, they could be in the foundation program, and that might be, as you see, multi-level. So you can have kids that are labelled or they're officially enrolled as year 12 or 13, but they might be in the foundation program. That's not what's happening in the school where I am now, and this is really a big problem because they are enrolled as year 11 or 12 or 13, and they are really new learners of English. They're being put into the EAL classes for those year levels, but don't have any English. So, this is really problematic. And then they're also taking some subjects and they just haven't got a clue. So chipping away at change is really, I suppose, happening in the background, and I'm hopeful. But if they're beyond foundation, then I'm using Tamaki as an example, we had a junior academic program. You might call it EAL. We do at this current school I'm at for years 9 and 10. And then for the seniors who are in these year levels, and we had some year 13s as well, they did not, most of them, pretty well all of them didn't attend mainstream English, but they attended academic English through us. And then in the holidays, like I heard you speaking earlier, alerting to holiday learning, this was free. And we have offered over some of the holidays, especially the Christmas break, holiday learning. So I'm going to skip that. So subject selection is, but who's involved is probably of interest to you. So in the subject selection, in the ideal, and how do you get people all to be available? But we did manage, it took some years, we did manage at Tamaki College to have pretty well all these people involved at a point where a decision was made. and that we were also very fluid and responsive, that if we'd placed or misplaced or inappropriately placed, that we would be very agile in being able to adjust, that the timetables could be easily adjusted. And we have a senior leader who is very responsive to being able to change because this isn't working for the student. So if you take, say, like a timetable, this is a 10-day timetable. I've only looked at the first 5 days. If you're a foundation student, you might take maths, you might take art, again, it depends, or PE, but largely you can see that a lot of the days are almost fully foundation. In my view, it would be good to have a complete intensive 5 days a week, at least till, in this school, they have only one period in the afternoon, so that it is intensive. I think, because of all the constraints of funding and all of that, we make decisions, but is it as optimal as possible? And so your students have to go along with it. But if you're a new learner of English and you're at foundation, really a nice intensive, month or 6 weeks would be ideal in my view. That doesn't mean that you don't go to homeroom, that you don't maybe integrate for at least one. That is a subject that you don't need a lot of language for, and then you begin to, integrate with some of the students. But the priority is learning English. So if you then take, out stage 1 or stage 2, then this is kind of what our program looked like last year. So they took junior academic English, but they topped it up with what was called study English, and they were beginning to take on more subjects. But social studies proved always an issue, so we peeled back on that for some students and they did more study English. Or science was often an issue because they didn't understand what was going on. So again, you have to, and that this very strange label here is actually the maths. But again, some of our refugee students had no maths learning pretty well, none. And social studies is a problem from a cultural point of view, let alone a language point of view. And science, again, many of them hadn't been to school for ages, for years. And so all of this is a challenge in our thinking, isn't it? Because you want them to learn science, you want them to learn social studies. Well, it's not a priority for me. You want them to learn maths. But if they haven't had any foundation much in that, then why throw them into the deep end? So we actually were also running little groups for maths in our space, so that those who were basically hadn't been learning maths or had learned maths in a very in a poor context of teaching and learning, that we took them through more basic work in maths and also the language of maths. And then for the senior students, who by then anyone that was in this kind of program, they had already acquired more, certainly spoken English, listening and speaking, and were not in mainstream English, but were trying to get some English language standards. And so this is really minimal. You can't do much, but at least there were 2 doubles and 1 single per every 5 days. So it's kind of like an example. I'm not saying that this is ideal, but that's what it looked like. Do you want to ask a question? I'm very conscious of the fact it's already 4:30.
You good? You good. Yeah. We're all good for you to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel very humble in what I'm talking to you, because some of you are long in practice, and most of you, I presume. And I'm not kind of saying, I don't want to seem as though I'm coming across as that I know it all. But I have to say that I have been long in the game. Yeah, that's why all the wrinkles you're seeing. So I was going to now link into this. Now, Rachana, just checking with you and Amber, what time are we finishing?
10 minutes for question and answers, but I think they're doing. Yeah, I think another 10 more minutes.
So
another 10 more.
Maybe I do a 10 minutes, which will be just like a run through this. And I hate doing this because I want to dwell on things, and then we only have 5 minutes for questioning, and then maybe we need to slow down to think about how I could do more justice to you. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
All right. So I have to go into this and it will hyperlink. Just tell me if you can see it, because can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'll just have a quick read of what's going, in front of you now. So of course, spoken English, written English, and then sitting in the middle of that is vocabulary. I'm not going to dwell on any of that now, but ultimately the assessment that we're doing is being responsive to each of those unique learners that we've got in front of us. And somehow or another, if we were, again, really clever at this, we would we would have all the ducks lined up, but we would be able to be assessing each of our students so that we get a fuller picture. Now, that does not occur in a lot of schools, and to the detriment, I think, ultimately of the outcomes. I've spent, and this is an admission, I spent too long with students in front of me thinking that I know the student, but because we haven't done a full-blown assessment, formative assessment, diagnostic assessment, then we've overassumed or underassumed their capability. These are from the a book, which now is not published anymore, but they are available. If you're interested in that, I've got the books here beside me, and so in that book, it's really quite diagrammatic, which is called Effective Transition into Schools. Then, it's got these maps of what you might ideally do. And again, it does mean that you would know more about the fluency, speaking and listening, and the literacy capability, reading and writing in their own language. Because again, if we don't know that, then we're turning a blind eye to very vital influencing information that affects their English language learning. Again, if you haven't seen this series which is in the ALP Pathway resource from the ministry, there are seven videos that I made just with the ministry, and you might like to think about having a look at those, even as a cluster. And particularly I've put here, the code switching one, because our reality is when we have our students in front of you, they are constantly code switching. And for us to think really carefully about how does that externalize, but what's internalizing that we can't see. Code switching is a reality for all bilingual people, trilingual people, including myself. So let's have a think. What? So yes, if we're assessing, we want to assess those modes, and what in particular. So from a spoken language, yes, the vocabulary, the phonological knowledge, yes, in spoken, their conversational turn taking, what's their utterance structure like, their extended text that is self-generated, and then going across to the other modes of reading and writing. What's their knowledge of vocabulary, their word grouping, their clause knowledge, all of that. So below sentence level and at and above sentence level, if we, in the ideal, can have information about that from the student, then that's what we want to be able to diagnostically and formally and informally, but especially informally, through formative assessment, know. So from a listening point of view, yeah, what's their length? What do they understand? This is really critical, and it should inform what all mainstream teachers know about each student. their vocabulary knowledge, what do they understand for the lexical chunking or the word grouping structure of English, and the speed and flow and prosody of listening to spoken English. One given is that teachers talk really fast in the classroom. You probably do not. You will use deliberate text and recycle it, but in mainstream classes, I'm sure you've noticed that. The speed is native speaker speed, and that is usually means that a very large amount or significant amount just goes, it doesn't even go into the air because they don't understand it. So also when they're speaking, what's their grammatical structure? How can they express what they know and their ideas and their thinking in English language? All of this. All right. So word recognition, that's a really, really, really important thing. And you know that I've co-authored with Paul Nation on a book called What Every Teacher Should Know About Vocabulary. And, you know, this is really critical. I'm sure that every single day I say to my students, if you don't collect 10 to 15 new words a day, you are not going to catch up to try and keep up. You just can't. And again, with writing, the complexity, as you know, but really it also, I tell you what, I kind of got really strict today with my year 7 to 9 EAL students because they somehow or another will not get through their heads that letter form and position and shape actually does matter in English. And it really irks me. Of course, the higher level demand is much bigger than that. Are they growing their vocabulary? What do they know in terms of the collocations in English, etc., etc. All right, so this is a book that you may or may not have on your shelves, but I suggest if you don't, it's my kind of Bible, even though, you know, it was written a long time ago, it hasn't dated. I'm not going to go into this right now, but just because of the short 5 minutes that I've got left, what would the learner profile look like? And so I've just honed in here. These might be, I know that you have year 11 to 13 as well, but here are some students. And in particular, what about Melly, who is year 10? She's Tongan, and she's been here under a year. Now, this was a real student, not this year or last year, but that was a real student. And so what would you, this map, I hope, might give you an idea of what would be sort of like your smorgasbord that you would call on. Now, I just have to do a bit of a side issue to this. I'm currently doing some work for a lawyer for particular cases of people who are from different language backgrounds and contesting, I suppose, or trying to provide the language a language assessment of what they understood when they were arrested, what they understood when the process was going on, and what their rights were, and what they understood with what they were being charged, and all of that. Now, you might say, what's that got to do with this? Well, it's got to do with the fact that we're doing when I do a bilingual assessment, and yes, I'm working with a bilingual person with me, we basically do almost all of this depending on the case. So if you think that it's kind of like, oh, well, that's what we do at schools, but we wouldn't do it somewhere else, well, that's exactly what I'm doing in improving, I suppose, or at least showing what the capability is, not only in their first language, but also in English. So if you look here at the year 7 to 9s and the 10s to 13s, would you do letter knowledge? Yes. Would you do that? Yes. Would you do conversation? Definitely. Photo talk is a good stimulus for getting them to be able to speak to you on a topic without you being in conversation. Would you do a record of English? Yes. Would you do fluency and comprehension? Yes. Would you do dictation and self-generate? Yes, you would. So if they're out stages 1 and 2, what about that? Would you do the same? Yes, 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 as you can see. Because although you might say, well, why would you do a record of oral language? You don't have to do the one that's in the diagnostic book. You can actually make one with AI. You could even make one that has much more levels of complexity and see what they can retrieve. Because in the classroom, undoubtedly, if they're taking physics or economics or geography or whatever they're taking, then they will be having high demand of complex text. So just as taking Melly as an example, this was done with Melly, and this is real. I haven't made it up. She was a foundation student. I always include a conversational to and fro and record that. And how many turns can they take with understanding and comprehension? Record of oral language. So assessing, the turns, uh, photo response for speaking. So this is also listening. And integrated, I usually also, well, dictation is also an integrated tool. And then reading, so self-selected usually. So I have a range of texts. I don't use ones that I've got ready for, say, read that or read that. They look at texts and they select the one that they think is in their Goldilocks zone. And I look at their fluency and look at their comprehension and use retail as the baseline for that. And then, record of oral languages, sentences you can use for dictation. They can nominate a topic for self-generated. And then the high frequency, the picture vocabulary scale test that I helped develop with Paul Nation and Anthony, what's his name? Uh, but also, you can analyze a spoken recorded text for vocabulary by using the vocabulary profiler. So in Melly's case, you could then do a summary of what we noticed around the modes and what we noticed around the vocabulary. And from this, you can now make a recommendation. So we haven't got time to look at that, but that's kind of like what I thought, well, if nothing else, I can share that with you. And I feel unhappy about it because I've just romped through it and we don't have much time now, but there has to be a full stop somewhere. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing. I think I'm going to stop sharing, stop share. And I'm going to leave it to you if you've got some questions. Firstly, I don't know if I've landed well with you. Like you could be going, oh, you could be. Um, Believe me, I've put enough time into it, so I've tried my best.
Thank you.
A few minutes for Q&As. Stunned silence.
Yeah.
I've got a question, Jannie, thank you. It's been really great to hear all this. What are your thoughts on like a non-ESOL teacher, support staff person administering like the diagnostic assessment, just in terms of like capacity and, like I teach a full load 18 periods plus a tutor class, and the time it takes is like a lot to do these sorts of diagnostic assessments. What do you think about someone like the support staff, teacher aide doing this?
Well, it takes skill, doesn't it? It takes a knowledge. And so I would say that in generally a senior leader would not be the appropriate person, but I do have a I will work with a learning assistant. So they watch me and they know, for example, how to do maybe a conversational, always audio or video record a conversational to and fro, although that's always a little bit tricky, but they can do some of the high frequency vocabulary, they can do some of the record of oral language, but you have to train them well and they have to be really spot on learning assistants. But I do use them because they're clever people too. But I think if we throw it at them too quickly and we don't give them the support so that they optimize the information they're gathering, then I think it's kind of like feels like a waste of time. I recognize absolutely what you're saying. We're all busy people running from one class to the other and stretched to the hilt. So, in this year, because we've had some concerns about students, I've just had to put that time in and pull myself out of something so that I can do it. Because in the end, it is very skillful work to do that diagnostic, full-blown assessment. So there isn't an easy answer. But I mean, I think if you've got a learning assistant that's, maybe already got a degree, was well trained, picks up things and has, you know, very logical ways of thinking, but they aren't trained teachers usually, although we have some learning assistants that are trained teachers, or that they've worked beside you a lot and they see what you do, then they can be at least doing partially the some aspects of the bilingual assessment. If you teach them, for example, like I've developed a dictation screening, and from really easy moving up to more complex. And if you teach your learning assistant how to administer that properly, then they can administer that. There are various areas in the smorgasbord that they can do really competently, and there are others that I think have to be really nuanced, skillful you doing it.
Thank you.
Has it landed, what I've shared?
Yep.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you to mention peer support. What kind of things have you done that you feel have worked? Because I have a couple of students that isolate themselves in the playground. So
Yeah.
do you have programs that you've done, or
Well,
what do you?
so you've got peer support within the group, and you've got peer support outside the group. And you can't assume that within the group that it's all hunky-dory either. And so there've been, I guess one thing about that is that you really try to develop a family atmosphere of we're all here to support each other. We're not better than someone else. And yes, we have intercultural differences. We have got students, and we certainly got students at the current school I'm at, where they are very isolated still. And then you hear like, oh, he was racist and she was this and, whatever, not at the boys' school, but so I think, one of the things in the ideal is that the school itself is really attentive for all students, that they pay attention to what it might be like if you're new to a country, new to a system, new grappling with language. But boys are boys or girls are girls, and there's, we're all pretty egocentric in a way, although there's very many altruistic students as well. Some of the students that have been isolated in the last years, where I've been at Tamaki College, I've identified some students that are external to the group and they're really lovely people, and asked them to befriend, but it's not always landed properly. So I think it's a really delicate one, but I have a grandniece that's very isolated at school, and it pains her mum every single day because she comes home sometimes crying. So I think, somehow or another, I don't have a formula, but we can't have lonely kids and we can't have kids that are isolated. We just can't. So, however, I do think that in the big picture, if your school really calls itself a multicultural school, then everyone, all classes, are reaching in and involving in some way or another. Often it breaks the cycle if they're involved in sports, but some kids just are not coping with really everything feels so foreign. They don't know how to make friends, and so again, as I've said to you, reaching in or into a new group, if I'm the immigrant student, is hard. So how do you get kids to say it? One time, this is years ago now, in my own classroom, and we had some new migrant students. I created this whole sort of spreadsheet, and I said everyone can do something to make that person feel welcome and included. And the boys go, woof, it's a girl. Um, well, I said, a smile costs nothing. Saying hello costs nothing. Saying goodbye, just saying how things, even if you don't get an answer. Where other students said, well, we could include them in when we're playing in at interval, so you have different layers, but everyone takes a responsibility. I